In November of 2007, a scientist stood on the edge of a 50-foot wide crater in the Peruvian high desert. The crater was full of water. But despite its innocent-looking appearance, this crater full of water held incredible danger. When it formed 2 months earlier, hundreds of people and animals in the area had gotten violently sick, and so far, no one had come up with a good explanation for how this was possible. In fact, according to the laws of physics, the crater shouldn't even exist. It was a mystery that had researchers all over the planet scratching their heads. But as the scientist stared down into the big crater, he thought he might have the answer to both of these mysteries. And if he was right, it would mean that the threat posed by this crater was far greater than anyone imagined. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please ask the follow button to come skip some stones with you on a lake, but when the follow button isn't looking, steal their phone and skip that into the water. Today's story is called The Carancas Curse. It was a chilly morning on September 15th, 2007. A sheep farmer named Gregorio Yaruri sat on his porch, sipping a mug of coffee and looking at the distant mountain peaks that surrounded his hometown of Carancas, a small village in southern Peru. It was silent except for the sheep bleating in the pasture. Then Gregorio heard a low sound, like a hum. At first, the noise was faint, and it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Then the hum grew louder, and the coffee in his mug started to vibrate. A moment later, pebbles on the ground surrounding his porch began to shake as the hum turned into a roar. Alarmed, Gregorio set down his mug and leaped down into the yard. He looked around, trying to figure out if the noise was human-made, or maybe an earthquake. He covered his ears as the hum roared to a deafening scream. Then he spotted something small and orange streaking through the sky. An instant later, a sonic boom whipped across the valley, shattering a window in Gregorio's house. He was thrown onto his back and he rolled a few times before steadying himself in the dirt. Noises began to erupt all across the plain. Gregorio could hear dogs howling and shouts coming from some of the neighboring farms. Gregorio was bracing himself for something else to happen, but the sky above him was bright blue again. So he stood up, feeling totally shell-shocked, as he brushed the dust from his pants. He scanned the horizon for some clue as to what had caused this explosion. In the distance, he could see a plume of thick black smoke rising 100 feet into the air. At first, Gregorio was filled with dread. Then, a sense of determination swelled up inside of him. He needed to know what had just fallen from the sky. He ran for the bicycle he kept leaning up against the side of his house. He brushed the glass shards from his broken window off the seat, and then he hopped on and he set his feet on the pedals and took off towards the tower of smoke. As Gregorio neared the site of impact, the smell of rotten eggs stung the inside of his nostrils. He pulled over just long enough to grab his bandana out of his back pocket and tie it around his face to block the smell. About 100 feet from the tower of smoke, he noticed red dust covering the ground. The closer he got, the thicker the blanket of dust seemed to be. When he finally reached the base of the smoke plume, he rubbed the dust with his feet. It appeared to be clay that had been kicked up by the crash. The smoke was so thick, he still couldn't tell what had impacted the ground. But whatever it was, it had created what appeared to be a huge crater in the ground. The column of smoke was emerging from a hole about 50 feet across. It really looked like someone had just detonated a bomb there. A few minutes later, the smoke started thinning out, and Gregorio could finally see into this crater. He walked up to the edge, and his eyes widened from a combination of fear and wonder. The crater was filled with a dark green liquid. The liquid had a consistency somewhere between maybe water and sludge, and it was bubbling as if it was simmering. Gregorio pinched his nose through the bandana. The egg smell coming off of this crater was so strong that he felt sick to his stomach. He walked around the perimeter of the crater, kicking at the shards of clay and jagged rock that littered the ground. It looked like someone had smashed a huge vase to pieces. Gregorio scanned the horizon. It seemed like he was the only person who'd come to investigate this plume of smoke. He figured the neighboring farmers must be worried that whatever crashed into the ground was a bad omen. A lot of his neighbors still believed in ancient spirits. But after a while, it struck Gregorio as kind of odd that not even an emergency vehicle had come out to survey the scene. Something had just shot out of the sky and smashed into the earth. It felt like that was the kind of thing police would want to know about. But Gregorio knew help would not be coming from his village. Only about 250 people lived in Caracas, so it didn't have its own police force. The authorities were located in the nearby town of Desaguadero, which was about 7 miles up the road. Gregorio wasn't sure if the folks in Desaguadero would be able to see the smoke plume from there. If they couldn't, he worried that the authorities might not even know this happened. Gregorio jumped back on his bicycle and pedaled to the house of a neighbor who owned a motorcycle that Gregorio knew he'd be able to borrow. It was going to be up to him to raise the alarm, and he had to get out there fast. About 20 minutes later, Gregorio parked his borrowed motorcycle in front of the police station in Desaguadero and then walked inside. He was greeted by a tired-looking receptionist with the phone pressed to her ear. It seemed like she'd been talking to people for hours. 3 deputies were talking loudly about an airstrike. It took a minute for Gregorio to realize what was going on. The police did know about this explosion. One of them had seen the orange streak in the sky, but they thought that Caracas had actually been struck by a missile. Gregorio waved down one of the officers and explained he had seen a crater filled with this green ooze that smelled terrible. The officer disappeared into a back room for a moment, and then he returned with the chief of police. They asked if Gregorio could lead them to the crash site. Gregorio agreed. Soon, he was back on his neighbor's motorcycle, leading police cars along the 7-mile road back to the Caracas countryside. As the crash site came into view, Gregorio could see people moving around the rim of the crater. As he drew even closer, he realized that dozens of villagers from Caracas had come to see what had caused the smoke. He guessed that when the black plume of smoke had dissipated, the neighbors figured it was now safe to come take a look. Gregorio pulled over his motorcycle about 20 yards from the crater and dismounted. The police cars fanned out around him. As policemen approached the perimeter of the crater, Gregorio noticed his neighbors picking up rock fragments as souvenirs and pointing at the green liquid at the bottom of the massive hole. Gregorio overheard a nearby couple speculate that maybe this was the result of a missile strike from Peru's neighbor and rival, Chile. One teenage boy was talking excitedly, telling his friends they were probably just attacked by a UFO. An old woman, who Gregorio assumed was the boy's grandmother, told him to be quiet. This was clearly a sign of bad things to come, a curse sent by the spirits. She sounded terrified. Gregorio did not find any of these theories very convincing. However, he wasn't ready to offer any of his own. But the strange explosion had him just as curious as his neighbors. He picked up a shard of deep red rock near his feet and slipped it into his coat pocket, just as another car pulled onto the scene. Gregorio recognized the mayor of Caracas, Maximiliano Trujillo. Mayor Trujillo stepped out of the back seat, squinting in the sunlight. The mayor walked toward the crater, looking stunned. He stopped right next to Gregorio and asked what happened. Gregorio just shrugged, still in disbelief. Straight ahead of them, a pile of black rocks were smoking at the edge of the crater. The mayor's eyes widened when he saw them, and he began walking toward the crater to get a better look. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered at the crash site. Gregorio stood near the front of the crowd, hoping that if he stuck around long enough, the police might announce what had caused this explosion. As the sun started to set, the smell of rotten eggs returned. It was faint, but pungent. Gregorio's eyes began to water. He pulled his bandana back up over his face, but that didn't work anymore. The smell was giving him a headache. A few minutes later, a short woman standing near Gregorio leaned over and began vomiting, and she wasn't the only one. People all around the crater were starting to get sick. Between the rotten smell coming off the green sludge and now the vomit, the air around the crater was now so thick that Gregorio thought he might faint. He fought his way through the crowd back to his motorcycle and sped off towards home, sucking in the fresh air as he went. When he walked through his front door, his phone was ringing. It was his son, who had moved about 6 hours away for a job after he had graduated school. As Gregorio told him about the afternoon's excitement, he took the rock out of his pocket and he laid it on the kitchen table. He began to describe its deep red color, but his son cut him off. He begged Gregorio not to touch it. If Carancas was attacked by a missile, then this red rock could very likely be radioactive. Gregorio remembered the people getting sick at the crater. He felt a surge of anxiety, and he covered the rock with a dish towel. If his son was right, half the town was now vulnerable, and Gregorio spent more time at the crater than anyone else. Panicked, he hung up on his son and ran outside to hose himself off. He didn't know how much it would help, but he had to do something. He spent the rest of the evening feeling totally anxious, until finally he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Gregorio woke up with the sun as usual. He still felt a bit queasy, but no worse than the night before. He breathed a big sigh of relief, because he figured that radiation poisoning would have made him feel a lot sicker by now, and so probably he was in the clear. As the sunrise turned the sky a vivid pink, Gregorio walked out of his house towards the sheep pen. He grabbed tufts of hay and dried grass and scattered them on the ground, and the sheep came running over to graze. Gregorio watched until one of the sheep picked its head up and ambled away. Then he noticed something unusual. There were dark splotches on the hay right where the sheep's head had been. It took Gregorio a moment to realize what he was looking at. He walked over and grabbed the sheep that had ambled off, and he lifted its head up, and blood was trickling out of its nose. Then he looked at the ground. Another splotch of blood stained the hay beneath his feet. As he walked the length of the pen, he found drops of blood spattered all over the ground. Gregorio rushed inside and called his vet, expecting to leave a voicemail since it was still early, but to his surprise, the vet actually picked up. He sounded wide awake, like he'd already been up for hours. He said that he'd been getting calls all morning. Livestock across Carancas were getting sick. The vet promised to make Gregorio's farm his next stop. Gregorio thanked him and hung up. He had no idea what kind of sickness had emerged from that crater, but it seemed like it could be deadly. A few days after the crash, Mayor Trujillo walked between rooms at a health clinic. Every exam table had been turned into a makeshift hospital bed. More than 200 people who visited the crash site had flooded the hospital in Desaguadero. They were all sick with migraine headaches, and they were vomiting. The hospital got so overwhelmed with patients, they diverted people to smaller health clinics throughout the city, which were now acting as satellite operations. Mayor Trujillo had called the Red Cross to help administer care in these satellite clinics, but now even the clinics were completely full. The smell inside the packed clinic was terrible. People were retching and crying. To the mayor, it felt like he was walking through a war zone. Thankfully, he'd received confirmation that morning from the authorities in Lima, the capital of Peru, that Carancas had not been attacked by a missile. In fact, scientists said that the crater had been caused by a meteorite. Mayor Trujillo was relieved that they were not under attack, but a mystery remained. Nobody knew why people were now getting sick. Meteorites had never been known to have that kind of effect. Specialists were flying out from Lima to investigate further. Mayor Trujillo moved through the crowd of patients in the waiting room, trying his best to reassure them. He stopped by a Red Cross doctor who was tending to a small elderly woman on a folding chair. The mayor greeted the old woman and then thanked the doctor for traveling all this way to Desaguadero. The doctor stood upright, looking tired but hopeful. He explained that all the patient's blood work was coming back normal. He didn't know why they were sick, but judging from their symptoms, he said everyone should make a full recovery in a few days. Trujillo smiled with relief, but the old woman hissed and called the doctor a liar. Many of the patients around her nodded in agreement, eyeing the doctor like he was in on some big conspiracy. He heard them muttering about evil spirits causing this disaster. Trujillo knew that many villagers believed the meteorite was a curse from the ancient spirits, and because of that, many had refused to listen to the Red Cross doctors and aid workers. To Trujillo, this was the problem with people of the Carancas region. Outsiders never came to the area, so many of the villagers didn't trust them. Trujillo knew that Carancas was not cursed. He just needed to find a way to get his people to listen. Then an idea struck. Maybe he could get them to believe the science with the help of someone who could appease the spirits. Trujillo left the health clinic, climbed into his car, and drove the 7 miles to Carancas. The small village, nestled in the shadows of snow-capped mountains, was eerily quiet and deserted. As the mayor slowly drove through the narrow and winding streets, he could see people peering out their windows. Normally, they'd come outside to wave hello, but now it seemed like they were terrified of leaving their homes. A few minutes later, Trujillo pulled up to a small adobe house with a thatched roof. It belonged to the local shaman, a man the mayor had long respected for his wisdom. Everybody in town trusted the shaman, and Trujillo hoped he could bring some calm to the community. Trujillo stepped out of his car, and he was pleased to see that the shaman came out of his house to greet him. Trujillo explained the situation to the shaman, and the shaman nodded thoughtfully, and he agreed that the meteorite was not a curse, although it had disrupted balance in the land. And so he said he was happy to do his part to restore the natural order of things. Trujillo smiled and shook the shaman's hand. He promised he'd be in touch soon, and then Mayor Trujillo headed back to his car. With the shaman's help, he was sure he could get the townspeople to listen to him and restore order in the town. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Montreal, Canada, a professor named Peter Schultz was standing in line at a coffee shop scrolling through the news app on his phone. He taught Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University in Rhode Island, but he was in Montreal for a conference on craters made by meteorites and other space objects. He was fascinated by the articles about the meteorite strike in southern Peru, and not just because he found meteorites in general interesting. This one stuck out because it made no sense. The reports said that Carancas was struck by a chondrite meteorite, the most common type of meteorite, but also the most fragile. A chondrite meteorite is a type of rock that comes from asteroids. They're made up of small grains of minerals that have not been melted or changed much since they formed billions of years ago. Chondrites are so porous that they crack and burn up in Earth's atmosphere before they can hit the ground. To Peter, it seemed impossible that one of these chondrite meteorites could hit the Earth with enough force to create this massive crater. Stranger still, he had read that more than 200 people who visited the crash site had ended up in the hospital. Meteorites should not be making people sick. Peter thought there had to be more to the story than met the eye. Peter turned his phone to silent and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back lectures at his conference. He finally left around dusk. As he walked to dinner, he noticed his voicemail was full of inquiries from different reporters and news outlets, hoping for a comment from him on how a meteorite could cause such a widespread sickness. But Peter had to tell these reporters the truth. He did not have answers, but he wanted to get them, and the only way to do it was to head to Peru and see the crater for himself. A few days later, Mayor Trujillo stood in the very crowded community center in Desaguadero. He had needed a huge space to hold this town hall meeting, and Carancas didn't really have a building that could accommodate this size crowd. Even this community center was packed with almost every single person from Carancas in attendance. The mayor shivered, but not because he was cold. He knew that the government scientists had discovered something that would have a profound impact on everyone in this area, and not just for those who had gotten sick at the crater. As Trujillo stood there waiting, he spotted Gregorio Yaruri sitting in the back. He was grateful to him for his role in alerting the authorities and was happy to see that Gregorio looked healthy. In fact, most of the locals who'd gotten sick were starting to feel better. But Trujillo knew if they didn't listen to the scientists, then things could get worse again. Trujillo had invited 2 guests to this meeting. One was the local shaman, and the other was a geologist named Luisa Macedo. She was one of the scientists flown in by the government. The mayor made his way to the front of the crowd and called for silence. He had to choose his words carefully to avoid panicking those who believed that Carancas was actually cursed. He cleared his throat and announced that, yes, something had fallen from the sky, but it had been a meteorite from outer space. Before anyone could argue with him, he called the shaman over to join him and asked if he could prepare a sacrifice. It needed to be something that would appease the spirits in case they were the ones who sent the meteorite crashing to Earth. The shaman nodded. He told the crowd that they had rightfully sensed that the meteorite had unbalanced the land, but he reassured them that the correct sacrifice would help appease any unhappy spirits. He promised he would sacrifice a llama fetus at the crater as soon as possible, which should be enough to restore harmony to the area. Several of the older women present smiled, but Mayor Trujillo was still tense. Now came the hard part, getting them to accept the scientists' findings without panicking. He introduced Luisa, the government geologist. The hall erupted in whispers. Trujillo told the villagers to calm down, that Luisa was from southern Peru just like they were. That's why he'd asked her to speak. Everyone seemed to accept this, since a regional scientist seemed a little more trustworthy. The crowd settled down a bit, and then Luisa smiled and she held up a large cardboard chart she'd made showing data on the local water table. Trujillo held his breath, worried she was making things more complicated. Instead, the crowd pushed in to get a better look at what she had. Luisa explained that she and her team weren't totally sure what was making so many people and livestock sick, but they had a strong theory. The day that she and her team had arrived in town, they'd gone to the crash site and collected samples from different parts of the area. They also tested the groundwater at the bottom of the crater. Mayor Trujillo saw Luisa hesitate for a moment and then continue. She said that her team found that the water contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a deadly poison. The crowd erupted in murmurs of alarm. As Trujillo looked around the room, he wasn't surprised by everyone's reaction. When he first heard Luisa's theory, he'd been stunned too, but he needed the crowd to listen. Their lives depended on what Luisa had to say. Trujillo raised his hands and called for order, and after a few seconds, the townspeople did quiet down, and he told them to continue to listen to Luisa. Luisa nodded, and then explained that when the meteorite hit Carancas, the shockwave caused the groundwater to heat up and vaporize. This caused the air to fill with a fine mist of arsenic vapor. Everyone who had gone to see the crater got sick because they had inhaled that vapor. After hearing what she had to say, the crowd became agitated again and started shouting questions. Mayor Trujillo saw Gregorio in the back, trying to be heard, and so Trujillo demanded everyone be quiet, and he pointed at Gregorio and asked him to speak. Gregorio, the sheep farmer, stood up and politely asked Luisa if that meant their drinking water was contaminated too. Luisa stayed silent for a moment. Trujillo could tell she was carefully thinking about what to say next. Finally, she nodded and said that although they did need to do more testing, it was very likely. In fact, most likely, their water supply had been contaminated for years, making the people less healthy and more vulnerable to deadly diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And so until they knew for sure, Luisa advised the crowd to just drink bottled water. Gregorio was alarmed by what he heard, but he thanked her and sat down. Everyone else seemed totally stunned into silence by Luisa's explanation. First the meteor hit, making people sick. Now they learned their water was contaminated all along. Trujillo knew it was frightening, but at least they knew what they were dealing with. After answering more questions, Luisa wrapped up her remarks and walked off the stage. But as she headed toward him, Mayor Trujillo noticed that the scientist looked anxious. He pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay. Louisa shook her head and told him that something still didn't make sense. She was confident that the sickness had been caused by arsenic gas from the meteorite impact, but she had not actually proven that. No scientists had detected arsenic in the air around the crater. That was a theory. In fact, she didn't understand how the meteorite could have gotten hot enough to create this toxic arsenic vapor. Louisa explained that meteorites are usually freezing when they impact Earth, even though they may look like they're on fire. That's because space is extremely cold, with an average temperature of negative 454 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction caused by entering Earth's atmosphere would have heated it up a little bit, but not enough to boil water and turn it into a mist. Mayor Trujillo frowned. He now realized that even Louisa wasn't sure that her arsenic theory was right. And if she was wrong, then something else had made his people sick. Trujillo was troubled. But he had a more immediate challenge, making sure the local drinking water was safe. It was up to the scientists to figure out whether arsenic vapor or something else had caused the mass sickness. Until they figured it out, Trujillo knew he would not sleep well. A little over 2 months later, in December of 2007, Professor Peter Schultz arrived in Caracas to investigate the crash site. On a dry and sunny day, he drove through the winding roads of the rugged countryside until he reached the crater. Even though the rainy season had nearly filled it with water, he was struck by how massive it was. Peter had heard about Luisa Macedo's discovery of arsenic in the water. There was no debate that there was arsenic in the water itself, but so far, nobody had been able to explain how, or even if, arsenic got into the air. Until that was proven, there was still the possibility that some other chemical from the meteorite's impact had made everyone sick. If that was the case, the people of Caracas could still be in danger. Peter was determined to find the answer and make sure these people were safe. And over the next few weeks, he was able to slowly form a theory that connected all the dots. Usually, when chondrite meteorites shoot through the Earth's atmosphere, their fragile makeup causes them to shatter into hundreds of tiny pieces, which turn to ash long before they ever reach the Earth's surface. And that's what should have happened with this meteorite. Peter concluded that the Caracas meteorite survived its passage through the atmosphere because of its high speed and shallow entry angle. He believed that these factors, along with the heat from the Earth's atmosphere, caused the outer layers of the meteorite to melt and fuse back together. That made it dense enough to make it through the atmosphere, where it became superheated and unleashed the arsenic vapor once it hit the ground. All this meant that the people of Caracas were safe. It was the meteorite and not some other unidentified danger that heated up the arsenic-laced water and turned it into vapor. Thankfully, the damage caused by the meteorite's impact was not permanent. All the people who'd gotten sick, including Gregorio Yaruri, made a full recovery, and so did all the animals. Thanks to the research of Luisa Macedo and the other scientists, arsenic was detected in the drinking water, and nonprofit organizations have installed measures to make it safer. Even though the water is cleaner and the arsenic gas is long gone, the people of Caracas will always remember when, in a way, they were attacked by a UFO. In 2005, Todd Geib was 22 years old. He lived in Michigan. He was an avid outdoorsman. He liked to go deer hunting. He loved to catch trophy fish, and he loved his family. And routinely, after he moved out of the house, he would drive on the weekends the 5 miles north to his parents' house and would spend lots of time with his parents and his extended family. On June 11th, 2005, Todd was visiting his parents at their house. He was there for dinner, and after dinner, he went back to his house. He checked in with his roommate, who was actually his cousin, and then following that, he drove to a local bar to get a few drinks. At about 9:30 that night, he decides to leave the bar and walk to this big orchard where there was this huge annual keg party that he and his friends would go to. He leaves his car at the bar and he walks to this orchard, and it's perfect weather. All of his friends are there. He's having this great time, and he's there all the way until midnight. It was getting late. Todd felt tired, so he told a couple of his friends that he was going to head home. He was going to leave his car at the bar, and he was just going to walk back to his house. The area that this orchard was in was right near his home, and so he knew this area extremely well, and it was only about a mile south to walk to his house. So all of his friends said bye to him. They said he seemed totally normal. They watched him walk south towards his house, and that was the last anybody saw of him. On his walk home, Todd would make 4 phone calls to friends and to family. And the last one he made was at about 12:45 in the morning, and it was to his friends, and he told them that he was in a field and he couldn't breathe. And they kept asking him, like, what are you talking about? And all they heard was very heavy breathing on the phone. They couldn't tell if it was his or if someone else had taken the phone and was now breathing into it. Then the phone cuts out, and they try calling him back, and there was no answer. They couldn't get in touch with him. The next day, when Todd did not show up at a family get-together, something he never would have missed unless he told them ahead of time, his family knew something was wrong. Plus, they had those strange phone calls the night before. They checked in with his friends. They said, yeah, we haven't heard from him. They went over to his house. He wasn't there. And so that's when they called the police. A massive search is kicked off involving canines and helicopters, and they're not finding anything. 3 weeks after Todd had gone missing, a couple was walking around this lake that was located north of the orchard where Todd was at that big keg party. And the wife looked out into the water and she said she thought she saw something bobbing. She couldn't tell what it was, but it was just this weird object that stood out to her. And she and her partner walked down to the edge of the lake and they looked out. And at first she thought it was a person who was swimming, just kind of bobbing up and down because their body position was such that their shoulders and head were totally out of the water. And so it was a strange sight, and they knew that it didn't seem right. So they called the police. Police show up, and it turns out that this person was Todd Geib, and they were deceased. When searchers found out that it was Todd Geib in the lake, their reaction was, no way. We have witnesses saying he was walking south after he left the keg party. Why is he in a lake way to the north of the keg party? It's in the complete opposite direction. Also, investigators were baffled at his body position because if he was a drowning victim, you would expect him to be face down in the water, as most drowning victims are. But for him to be upright, shoulders out of the water, it doesn't make any sense unless there's ice in the water to kind of prop him up. And there wasn't any ice in the water. His toxicology report showed that in addition to alcohol in his system, he had a very high dose of an antidepressant, something that he wasn't prescribed, and he didn't have any history of mental illness and had never been prescribed any antidepressant in his life. His body was pristine. It did not have any of the hallmarks, the bloating you would expect from being in water for 21 days. In fact, it was concluded that it was impossible for his body to have been in the water for all 21 days that he had been missing. His autopsy showed that he had almost no water in his lungs, even though his death was classified as an accidental drowning. When the news broke that this was an accidental drowning, the family and friends pushed for a closer examination of this case because it wasn't adding up. And so a noted pathologist looked at all of the evidence and determined that at most, Todd had been in the water for maybe 3 days, and he had almost certainly been deceased when he was placed in the water, which is why there wasn't any water in his lungs, and it's potentially why he was in that position that he was in, that upright position. Why are we calling it an accidental drowning still? And where was Todd from the day he went missing for those 15 to 17 days before he was placed in the water? And what did he mean when he was on the phone the night he went missing and said he was in a field and couldn't breathe? And what was all that breathing in the background? Lots of questions on this one.
Our next story is called 40 Years Later.
One of the most remote places in the world is Buldir Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. The weather on Buldir Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Buldir Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Buldir Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low effort job. And so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily, and it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly, they became very familiar with the whole island because it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on Buldir Island, so by now they know every square inch of the island, they're very comfortable here, they had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle, and he heads outside to do this patrol. And the other 4 are just sitting in the weather station, and after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there, and the weather at the time was very mild. You know, there's no snow on the ground, it's not very cold, it's not very windy, and the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain. But short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything. And they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what? He knows what he's doing. He's been here so long. He's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water. He's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island. They can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they were like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything. And now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you got to remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Buldir Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 1,600 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground, and he thought he saw something inside of it. And he got down and he looked and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton, and there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,500 feet to the top of this mountain? But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter, well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again, and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees, there was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder, let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself, so someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see, and what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Acid Trip.
On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels. And, Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards the stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping, it was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to, and he feels himself, he's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall, he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open and he climbed out of his car and he looked a little ways down the road and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side and it was hissing steam, and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck, and so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was. And then before the guy could do anything, the sliding door to the van flung open and this woman with blonde hair jumped out and she ran over to him and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman and he's kind of sizing her up, and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman and the old woman's looking right back, and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, "You know what? I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet." The woman just nodded and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out and she rushed over to the truck and she climbed on top of it and she reached down and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van and the white van sped off down the road and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, well, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him, and so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically. Meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Somosierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately, loads of sightings were reported of Juan. But every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear, and the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the U.S. Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found, he's still missing, and his case is still unsolved.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them.